And so the we have like two very powerful competing forces here. One is that the interest rates are putting downward pressure on a number of interest rate sensitive industries, commercial real estate and small businesses and junk rated companies and the like. But on the other hand, that interest expense is just completely blowing out the deficit, which is on its own, it's a stimulatory inflationary force.
In this finance discussion, Lyn Alden provides insights into the current economic dynamics. She discusses the conflicting forces impacting various sectors, such as industry rates affecting real estate and small businesses. Alden notes the unexpected balance created by rising interest expenses on the deficit. Contrary to predictions, she highlights a shift towards potential inflation, emphasizing central banks' ability to adapt during downturns. While cautious about Fed tightening, Alden stresses the importance of monitoring areas like bank contagion and treasury market stability. Overall, she presents a nuanced view of the economy, emphasizing industry-specific challenges and the continuous impact of fiscal injections. With that, let's dive into the rest of the video, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't.
Back in early 2022, when it became clear that the Fed was going to be quite hawkish, that was, my expectation was we'd have a recession by kind of later in the year, and that it'd be tough to get interest rates over 3% before you'd have kind of those types of problems. And for the most of 2022, that was correct. We had slowing economic indicators. We had 2 quarters of negative real GDP growth, even though they weren't technically a recession because they didn't have like an unemployment spike and stuff. But we had a period of softness. Asset prices had a pretty bad time across the board. Um, but then by early 2023, I started to see signs that it was playing out differently. That basically the fiscal deficits, ironically from part of that the monetary tightening, so the higher interest expense from the federal deficits, were starting to actually kind of balance themselves out. They were becoming kind of inflationary and stimulatory. And then when you had the kind of the mini banking crisis and the Fed's willingness to re-inject some liquidity in there to stop contagion, these things really kind of added up to a shift in how I viewed things. So it was, that's an example of being flexible, where you have a view, it starts playing out, but then after a certain point, it kind of starts being a little different. It's almost like if you're very tired and you stay up all night and you just kind of force yourself through it, eventually you almost get like another burst of being awake again. All right, that's kind of what we saw in markets where they got so tight on the fiscal side and the monetary side that we kind of went past the looking glass towards actually being somewhat stimulatory, because a lot of the private sector debt is low and fixed rate, especially in the household sector and in the investment grade corporate sector. So those industries have held up pretty well, whereas a lot of the U.S. federal debt is short term, and so that's been refinanced at much higher rates. And so we have like two very powerful competing forces here. One is that the interest rates are putting downward pressure on a number of interest rate sensitive industries, commercial real estate and small businesses and junk rated companies and the like. But on the other hand, that interest expense is just completely blowing out the deficit, which is on its own, it's a stimulatory inflationary force. And in the past year or so, they've been roughly balanced. There's been this narrative for several years that they can't create inflation, that the markets are too deflationary for them to do it. And I wrote an article back in 2019 where I said, are bonds in a bubble, or is this a new normal? And the conclusion of the article was it is a bubble. And I talked about how I was like, look, a lot of things look disinflationary, but if in the next downturn, central banks, they can completely change the rules and they can work with fiscal authorities and just have massive monetized fiscal deficits. It was almost eerie. I didn't talk about a pandemic in that article, but it's almost eerie what happened less than a year after that article came out. It was just completely the rules were changed. And that's what we've seen. And the reason I had that view is because that's when you get towards a sovereign debt kind of cycle nearing its sort of completion. And a completion can take a decade. It doesn't mean a completion like this 6 months. I mean like this era. Um,
Right.
the rules change, the cycles get tighter. Similarly, during March 2020, I wrote an article called "Why This Isn't Like the Great Depression," and that was like just in the early signs of seeing some of these stimulus. And so my view was, no, this is not going to be disinflationary. This is likely going to be inflationary
Right.
because the cavalry's response time is quicker, and because It's more like the 40s, not like the 30s. So I would consider the 2008 crisis to be very similar to the 1929 crisis. That was at all the hallmarks of a private debt bubble unwinding. But I think we're past that now. I think now we're towards the sovereign debt bubble, and the closer you get to the sovereign, the quicker the trigger finger is to come in with any sort of thing because it starts to potentially make the treasury market get illiquid. So if you look last year, during the 2022 gilt market blow up, right? So it's like September of last year, the UK gilt market blew up, and the Bank of England had to come in and do emergency QE for a number of weeks, even though they had 10% inflation at the time. And they had to cancel a speech about balance sheet reduction they were going to have the next day because you literally had a vicious cycle of more bond selling. And at the same time, the US Treasury market was like one step behind. It was like very illiquid. Bond auctions were not going well. It was looking very wobbly. And you started to see the Treasury offset the Fed. So even though the Fed was still being somewhat tight, the Treasury started drawing down its Treasury general account and taking other measures. That was kind of the part of the reversal. So basically, my view is that when push comes to shove and when it gets closer to the sovereign, inflationary forces can always be used to override the various debt-driven, disinflationary-driven forces in the economy. And so I will generally always err towards that inflationary outcome while risk managing it along the way and basically having a realistic time frame and diversification. And so, a country that controls its own unit of account is when push comes to shove, they print. And I'd be careful. That doesn't mean fully risk on because, for example, the Fed right now under Jerome Powell, his legacy is on the line. He is serious about tightening. Um, and it's one of those things where he doesn't, if the stock market drops 20%, he's not going to care. If credit markets have problems, if there's a big cycle of commercial real estate bankruptcy, he's not going to care. If anything, they're good. That's like things he'd probably like to see. The markets where they jump in quickly are bank contagion, anything adjacent to that, like repo spikes, like they did in 2019, or the treasury market itself, right? Those
Right.
are the cores of the system that that they're very unlikely to let struggle for long periods of time. Whereas almost anything else, you do have to be quite careful of. And that's part of why I don't expect, and for a while I have not expected, good stock or broad real estate returns, especially on a real basis, when you're comparing that to CPI or when you're comparing that to what you can get on a T-bill and things like that, the overall risk of those markets remains pretty high. But another way of looking at it is you mentioned 2.9 trillion in debt. But it's like we have 1.7 trillion in annual fiscal deficits, right? It's like there's a fire hose of deficits going into the market. So you can have trillion-dollar bankruptcies that are kind of offset by trillion-dollar just ongoing fiscal injections. And so even if
Right.
the Fed doesn't come to the rescue there, it's just that one industry is suffering, arguably right sizing. I mean, commercial real estate does have to go through a repurposing and just a change because we've changed, our technology's changed, our locations have changed. But on the other hand, I don't think you're going to see like restaurant sales go bust because the people that go to restaurants, a lot of them are on the receiving side of these very large fiscal deficits. And so it's a very kind of industry by industry market. And I think the overall aggregate is kind of stagflationary range bound type of thing where it's a very some people feel like what recession? I don't see a recession, and other people are racking up credit card debt to get by because for them it already is a recession, and it's just very industry specific, individual specific, and the overall range is that kind of murky sideways action.
In today's insightful discussion with Lyn Alden, we delved into the intricate forces shaping our economy. From the competing pressures of industry rates on sectors like real estate to the stimulatory force of escalating deficits, Lyn provided a nuanced view of the economic landscape. Her flexibility in adapting to evolving market dynamics, as seen in her reflections on the shifting scenario from 2022 to 2023, offers a valuable lesson in staying agile in financial analysis. Lyn's comparison between the 2008 crisis and the current sovereign debt cycle highlights the ever-changing nature of economic cycles. As we navigate these complex financial waters, Lyn emphasizes the role of sovereign inflationary forces, foreseeing potential shifts in the Treasury market. Her cautious optimism and risk management approach provide a well-rounded perspective for investors. We hope you found today's discussion enlightening. If you did, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below.